Hello again. So I'm convinced Sonia must be cloned. The amount of work you do in a year, Sonia, is astonishing. So congratulations on everything that you've achieved. Okay, so while the panel assembles, this is a slightly different approach to a session today. I think many of you are aware that there was a poll, there was a collection of suggestions in terms of the content we could cover. We haven't had a real pure eCOA session for a while, but this is an opportunity to kind of take that multi-stakeholder look at what's going on in eCOA implementation. So it's going to be kind of based on real-life experience of our colleagues within the panel. Standard disclaimer applies. Our objectives for the session: a number of frequently occurring scenarios in clinical trial execution and how they impact on eCOA from a various stakeholder perspective. And they're going to share their perspectives in terms of what they've done. So when planning for this session, there's been a lot of exchange of pain and agony that you've all dealt with in various aspects of eCOA implementation. And the key thing about this session today is that there's got to be some audience input. Get your phones out. I'm encouraging you to get your phones out. The QR code will appear in a minute. So we've got a few polls that will hopefully help sort of condition the discussion that the panelists have. There's a lot of eCOA experience in this room, so we'd love to get you to share your thoughts on each of these scenarios. So, and then we'll have the standard Q&A at the end. So Mentimeter is the tool we're going to be using. So give you a couple of seconds to get scanning. Please feel free to use the code if there's any issue with the scan, the QR code. And please note, you will not be able to skip ahead on questions. If you've got trouble, please use the web browser, as we said, and you will be anonymous, which is a shame, really. I'd love to chase you all down afterwards. Okay. Oh, sorry. Well, actually, the QR code's on the slides later as well, so if you missed it, you'll have another opportunity, and it's over for those on that side of the screen. You have it there as well, but we will have the QR code on these slides. So, without further ado, I can invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Paul.
Thank you kindly, Scottie. Thank you, everyone. Lovely to see everyone here. My name is Paul O'Donoghue, Senior Director for eCOA Product and Science at Medidata. Really looking forward to this discussion.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandros Rokotas. Glad to be here in this panel with many good friends. Looking forward to the session today. I'm an eCOA project manager at Bayer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anfray. I work as a principal in our patient-centered solutions team at IQVIA, and I oversee the licensing brokerage services as well as the partnership with copyright holders and developers of clinical outcome assessments. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lynn Germscheid. I work at Bristol Squibb, and I lead what we call eCOA implementation for the company across all therapeutic areas. I've implemented many, many eCOA programs. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Cook. I'm a senior project manager with the Accellacare site network, and I work across indications from vaccine to obesity to oncology.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We're actually thrilled to have a site representative here. It's a rare thing for us, so we're going to put not a lot of pressure on Jennifer, but a lot of pressure at the same time, but we appreciate it. So we've had a slight technical issue with the slides, so please bear with us for a moment. Okay, this is looking good. We're there. Thank you so much. So, first scenario. If you've already scanned the QR code, this should be presented to you on your device. So, the scenario, it's all theoretical, but again, sort of generally based on our experience. It's May 2026. Global clinical trial has several PROs to be captured electronically that support a key endpoint. The sponsor requires first site initiation visit by the end of August, but the copyright holder of one specific PRO is not responding to questions on licensing of the measure. I'm quite sure many of you in the room have dealt with this. So give us a vote. We'll be able to see this, just about see the scores at the end. Okay, we're going to give it about 15, 20 seconds, I think, to get through. It's a long way away, so I can't. Okay, keep those votes coming in. This is where my colour blindness becomes a slight issue as well, to be honest. But okay, you can all hopefully see on that side of the room what the general vote is. But what's the biggest one there? The 42%? Contact in other ways. Yeah, LinkedIn, cornering. Okay, we're good there. So let's have a little discussion on that. Oh, sorry, let's go back again. So let's start with, who's not? Caroline, can we come to you first on this one? How do you deal with this scenario?
Surprise, licensing, yeah. Well, thank you. I'm very interested in the results, actually, you know, to see the distribution. So
Caroline, we've got it down here now. Thank
oh, yeah, perfect. I can see that now. Thanks. Yeah, interesting. Well, so first of all, you know, in terms of my experience, as you may know, have been around for quite a while now, and this situation, this specific scenario is not something really new. You know, it's been a situation that I have encountered several times. At the end of the day, although it's a recurrent pattern, I'm pleased to tell you that it's not very frequent, to be honest. You know, so I want to reassure the audience about that. You know, having no response at all from a copyright holder is not something that we have every day. We have had this situation indeed, but we have possibilities to address that. Even I would even say it's a small percentage of the requests that we receive for copyright. And we know some of those copyright holders or questionnaires that are difficult to work with, or for certainly good reasons. But those unresponsive copyright holders, specifically for primary endpoint instruments, are known, and we can work on that. And I would like to take this opportunity of this situation to precisely say that copyright holders now are really partners, for using the questionnaire. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we had nothing. We have no rules, so it was a bit of a mess, to use properly clinical outcome assessment. So now copyright holders are here to help making sure that we get access to appropriate material, and so that's a good positive feedback, I would say here. So that's the occasion to remind that. And what I would like to also say here in this scenario, I would like to first to pause on how we can avoid that scenario, and maybe to pause on the prevention aspect. Everything that you can anticipate. It's obviously critical to early engage with the copyright holders. As soon as you have any information about the instruments that are shortlisted in your protocol, early engagement will make the difference. It's a critical step. It's critical to get the information about the condition of use, of course, but also the condition to translate, to digitalize, because this is this piece that is going to impact your timelines, and this is what you have to anticipate. And those conditions may very much vary from one copyright holder to another. So it's important to get this information early in the process. So that's critical, of course. What I can say as well is that to help in this prevention, education is key as well. Education to developers, of course, and copyright holders, so that they can share the information that we need to be able to move forward and do our work. But it's also education to users, because in this room, I think you are all very knowledgeable about clinical outcome assessment. But I have seen, a situation where clinical teams have no idea about those prerequisites to use clinical outcome assessment in clinical trials, specifically primary endpoint. So they cannot anticipate what they don't know, at the end of the day. So this is really trying to educate the users so that they can contact the copyright holder sufficiently in advance, for that. So that's key, of course. Another point is in terms of prevention. When you use regularly a questionnaire in your studies, well, that's the right time to develop specific relationship with the copyright holders and developers of instruments, so that at least you can potentially have a master license agreement, a partnership agreement, an eCOA library agreement, anything that, the trust that you are going to generate working with the copyright holders and helping you making the right decision at the right time, so that's very key. Maybe I'm going to pause here and see if my colleagues have any.
That's a very positive spin, and saying that you prepare well.
I could talk about that
never
for
a problem
hours.
for me. I've dealt with this myself, and it drove me insane. So, what about you, the rest of the panel? How have you addressed this in the past?
Maybe I'll just say the first thing I wanted to pick up on was the fact that 28% of you said remove the PRO measure and use an alternative with your site initiation visit happening in August. I think it's good to bear in mind with another scenario we have coming up in a few slides' time around that's maybe not the solution we might think it is. I just think from the eCOA provider perspective, I would just say, leaning on existing relationships, many of us as eCOA providers have teams dedicated to licensing and author relationships, so obviously leaning on those relationships as well. We obviously don't go live with study builds until we have a fully executed agreement. If we're actually dealing with this scenario, and I'll echo what Caroline said around that it's actually rare you get zero response from a copyright holder, I think that's something where there would then be a risk-based discussion with the sponsor around, well, what do we want to do here, and what do we want to document to demonstrate that we did everything we could do to try and get feedback from this instrument owner, and then maybe we do decide to move forward with a risk-based scenario as long as we're all comfortable. But it would very much be a conversation between all the various stakeholders involved.
Every panel needs a devil's advocate, right? So maybe to defend that 28% that voted for removing it, if we have this early engagement, that therefore, closer, okay, thank you. So if we have this early engagement, that therefore the sponsor and the eCOA vendor and the license vendor is communicating early on, then we could potentially have the capability to look at alternatives. But it won't be a possibility if we engage late. So, that could also be. Of course, I think looking at the results, the 41% makes sense because it's actually trying to tackle the problem at its root, and that's what we would do as a first measure. And then usually time doesn't allow us to do what this 28% wishes, but it could be the case if we do engage early.
Okay. I'd like to ask both the sponsors a bit later on, which one would you go with directly? Because I'm thinking we're so focused on risk management. In general, in clinical trial execution, right, it's about risk management. And I'm thinking, I'm going ahead and telling them. That's what I'm thinking, because this trial needs to happen. But anyway, sorry, Lynn, please go ahead with your perspective.
Sorry, So I know master service agreements for the larger copyright holders really work. They move the process along a lot faster. My question for you, Carolyn, is the smaller copyright holders, are they open to creating master service agreements?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lynn. Yeah, I think they would be open, but they don't necessarily have the capacity. That's the point. I think, with the small copyright holders or even developers of instruments that are just individual researchers, having this work done, with them, they have no legal teams or just a consult. So sometimes it's really a challenge for them. And we know also that sometimes even for mid-sized copyright holders, they have a license agreement that are set. They don't want to compromise on anything, and that they don't want to change any terms. It's just because it takes time for them to do so, and they don't have the capacity to do it. They don't have the resources and the staff to do it. So that's why sometimes they are so conservative, and they don't want to be flexible in changing the terms. So I think this is also our responsibility to help them, helping us. We can provide our support in specific statements that could help them to be applied to the whole community, and not just for one study, but helping them in the process. I think that could be an interesting point. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have anything else to add?
No.
Thank you. So how does this affect the site?
Sure, from the site perspective, when you have a tight timeline like this, and then you add in additional stressors, those stressors trickle down to the sites. So when you are being rushed with a vendor, that delays our access, and when our accesses are delayed, that does not give the coordinators enough time to get familiar with the platform, familiar with the everything involved that they need to do during their screening visit. And so our relationship with our subjects is key, and so we are going into that screening visit unprepared. We're not able to be efficient, and we're not able to be confident with that visit and with that platform, and we are giving these patients treatment. So we want to go in with confidence. We want to be prepared so that they know that they're in the best hands.
Yeah, it's such a high-stress time. You just don't need this kind of happening, and thinking of the consequences all the way down the line is important, right? I'm going to ask you, Lynn and Alex, which one would you have gone for?
Ladies first. So yeah, I think I would definitely strive for the 41% of figuring out a way. But if not, then it would have to be the third option for me. We would notify the copyright holder, we would identify the risk, we would make it as clear as possible. So write down what exactly we are doing in lieu of this feedback and what the next steps are, and take it from there.
Sounds good. Just do Lynn first and then back to Caroline.
No, I definitely would pick the 41%. I think that there's something that can always be worked out with the copyright holder. So I definitely would not do the 28%. I would not remove the PROA.
Thanks, Lynn.
Specifically primary endpoint. I think the risk is also really dependent on the information that you have on the questionnaire, because the risk is not really legal here, because the copyright holder is not responsive, so it's not your fault, So I think if you want to notify the copyright holder or what you want to do, the intention, and that you can prove that you have contacted them, several times during so, it makes sense to potentially move at risk, but you have to justify, you have to document to really prove your good faith, And the risk here, to me, it's not legal. It's much more on the scientific piece, because you have to make sure that you are going to get the access to the right version of the scale, the right translation potentially. If you don't have this from the copyright holders, that's the risk to me. It's not really the legal risk, because you can always have a retroactive license.
Yeah, the practical risk.
Even copyright holders do their retroactive license, potentially during their copyright watch. So, that's...
No, fair point. Thanks, Caroline. Scenario 1. Scenario 2. Could you move the slide forward, please? Okay. There we go. Protocol amendment, new country. The sponsor, it's always the sponsor, right? The sponsor wishes to enforce a protocol amendment that will include a new country while the eCOA system is in mid-development. Vote, please. We need a little clock, a little countdown clock here. So give it about 20, 30 seconds or so. Okay, we're kind of getting in there. Okay, ooh, yeah, we've got a clear. Still on scenario 1? You've got on 2? Well, we've got an awful lot being displayed over there, so that's interesting. Apologies for that slight glitch. Okay, we're going to move ahead with what we can see at this stage. So if it's possible to transfer the results to the speaker screen. I wonder if there might be an issue with the QR code, perhaps, but okay. The boats are still going up. This is good. Okay, well, I think we've got a kind of a leader here. My apologies for that issue. The 47 is translations. There's a shot. Lynn, how are you dealing with this?
Yeah, these are really good results, actually, what I would expect. So I'm going to share with you my perspective on how I would handle this situation. The first thing is to understand what the timelines are for the new country that's being added. It's very important that we know when that country needs to be implemented and what is our target for a patient, because we don't want to affect anything around the patient. We don't want to affect a system not being available, affecting their enrollment, et cetera. So that's always my primary thought, is what do we need to deal with here? And I back up from there because we have to start with obviously procuring the licensing for that new country for the instruments that are being used. So that's the first step in the process. Figuring out that timeline from there, and hoping that they're available licensed translations and versions for that country. If they're not, then you've got to go through the validation process. That'll take even longer time. Now, the vendor building the solution is set with their timeline, and we have to then incorporate the new country into their localization process so that that version is then appropriately implemented out to that country. So taking into account the entire timeline. And it could vary depending upon the scenario there. You may not have 6 months, or you may have a year. It just depends. You have to really assess what you have. Once you know what you have, then you have to figure out a mitigation strategy if you're not going to make it on time. And I've used a couple scenarios. I've actually implemented temporary paper for just those sites that aren't ready or where the system's not ready. And to do that, though, you really have to have really good SOPs, processes, and instructions for that site to properly manage that, because that data eventually has to be entered back into the system. And the controls around that are very complicated. You really need to understand what impact that has to the site before you implement that. But at least you're controlling the proper version, the proper paper license, et cetera, to ensure that everything is copacetic. The other scenario that I've used is, and this is rather costly if your study team has the budget, is to procure licensing ahead for any potential country that is in your list, in your toolkit there. So that's another option, because that will cut down at least the knowing is the instrument available, is it in that language, in that version, et cetera, and already set to go. And then all you have to worry about then is the vendor development of that localized version to go out to the site. So I'll pause there. I will see if there's any comments from my colleagues.
I love the point you made about letting a few sites start with paper. I think letting them getting going, a lot of times we have patients ready to go and we're just waiting on an aspect, so being able to get started with paper instead of rushing things and the timelines being real slim and the site feeling stressed, that would be great to start on paper and then eventually transition once the platform's ready.
Just one thing, starting on paper, so it doesn't prevent the risk if the paper version does not exist. If you have to develop the translation anyway, you have to anticipate this anyway on paper as well.
Yes.
So to me, I understand the results here that potentially the highest risk is the availability of the translation. Again, it's not necessarily specified if it's primary endpoint, but we know that we have to do a validated translation, so we know, the timeline. So being for paper and even more for eCOA, I think that's the critical part here from my perspective, not necessarily the licensing to me.
And to echo that, we also inherit the same approach at Bayer of proactively being prepared for more countries than what we would need. And this actually is a timeline thing as well, because site feasibility takes some time. So it's quite common that we wouldn't know when we are setting up the study which is going to be the full list of countries. So then we are kind of preventing this from happening by already covering the countries as they were to happen, not only on the licensing piece, but also on the translation piece. So this is, of course, costly, to Lynn's point, but then there could be some cost saving, because we could then get reconcile, that's the word I was missing, reconcile some of that budget on the licensing side, and also on the translation side. Part of it is actually performing the translations, but we also need to do the electronic migration, and that doesn't need to happen until we actually need to deploy. So we could prepare the steps that we can't prepare and spend the money for that good reason, and then be ready when we need it. That's what we also have been doing at Bayer quite often.
So I have a question for our sponsor representatives then. So if you have subjects or sites that start on paper, and then we move to the platform once it's ready, do those subjects get to continue on paper, or do they have to move to the platform, and how does that work?
I move the whole patient to the platform. So they do the retrospective data entry, they're in there, and then they start at the visit, at their next scheduled visit.
And do you see any issues with retention in that change or any pushback from patients?
We haven't to date. I mean, it works. I mean, we prefer electronic, obviously. We don't want to really promote the use of paper, but we want to do it to keep the patient and the patient enrolled, to get them in and not cause any delay for them. But no, we haven't seen that. I mean, it's really more of a site issue, to be honest, because the site has to catch up and be available and ready for that next visit for when the patient comes back in.
I could see that being an issue, having to pivot and train the patient, get them ready. It could add a little more time to that visit that we're not expecting, and then it could throw off our whole schedule and cause issues for the PI.
Yeah, that's why we like to do a lot of instruction to the site, and we try to minimize it only to those affected sites.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and maybe since you asked the sponsors, we would do the same. Maybe the small caveat would be the duration of the study. So if the study is very short, and therefore it wouldn't make sense to transition, then maybe we would decide that for this particular country, we would go full paper.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe I'll just add from the eCOA provider perspective, happy to add additional languages, happy to add additional questionnaires, linking back to the previous scenario, under the assumption, we're not expected to hit the same timeline, and Lynn and Alex, you're not expecting us to hit the same timeline, right? And that I think is one of the challenges we tend to see as eCOA providers is that scope changes, things change all the time, and we're very happy to accommodate those changes, but there then needs to be a discussion around the impact that has on the timeline. And I think, the reality is that the more common changes we tend to see tend to be less dramatic than the kind of scenarios we're talking about here. It's tweaks to diary wording, for example, which on the face of it seem like it should be very easy and not really have a meaningful impact on timelines, but the reality is actually there's all kinds of downstream impacts for even the smallest change, translations being the kind of obvious one. Even if you change one word in a diary, that's going to have all kinds of impacts on your translations and the quality of your build, which then will have knock-on impacts on your timelines. And as eCOA providers, we always want to accommodate that and meet the timelines that we've set at the beginning of the study, but there needs to be a back and forth around that and some understanding around the realities of trying to deliver these often very, very complex study builds.
Can I ask Jennifer, in that scenario you described about do you change to the platform when available, how does that really affect you? And what would you prefer in that scenario?
I think starting with paper, even if we had the switch, I do think that's beneficial, so we can go ahead and get started for recruitment, especially when you're adding on a new country, that time clock has already started. Patients started coming in the door in other countries and other sites, so for us to be able to meet our target and enroll as many patients as we can, I'd rather get that clock started, even if we have to plan and figure out how to mitigate once we switch the subject over. That's fine as long as we have good planning and can work with a sponsor and can work with the CRO to get those things straightened out ahead of time.
Yeah, I think an important message from this session is that we talk a lot about being site-centric. Obviously, patient centricity has been a thread forever. I feel like, as an industry, we need to do a bit more to try and accommodate the realities of the site perspective, so feel free to be honest. This is your chance, Jennifer, to say what you want to say. Thank you so much, panel. I'll try and change. Yes, works myself. BYOD. A clinical trial team is considering the use of BYOD. There's support from patient advisory groups, but concerns remain around perceived operational risks, evidence of acceptance of BYOD by sites and participants, and regulatory acceptance. Voting is open. Okay. So yeah, I forgot to say this is a word cloud one. I'm sorry, I should have made that really clear. I'm sorry. I have to give a little extra time for you to type here. That's free text entries, just a no. Yeah, that's not a surprise, is it? I can't see the other words now. If only we had some regulators in the room. Okay. A lot of votes still to come, but I think we can get moving. I see accessibility is emerging a bit as well. But regulatory acceptance is obviously the winner here. I don't see that changing. So, if I may, Paul, would you like to reflect on that and share your own perspectives of dealing with the BYOD question, which will not go away?
I would love to yet again talk about BYOD. No, I actually would love to talk about BYOD. I think the really important thing to say up front, to clear up, I think one of the persistent confusions around BYOD is when we say BYOD, we mean giving patients the option to use their own device, install an app, or maybe access a web browser through their own device, and also providing a provision solution alongside that for those patients who don't have a suitable device or maybe don't want to use their own device. And I think that's maybe one of the key confusions that drives a lot of this uncertainty, that when people hear us say a BYOD study, they think we mean 100% BYOD. The only option for patients to engage with that trial is to use their own device. And none of us, as reputable eCOA providers or as sponsors, mean that. There are maybe certain scenarios where you would consider 100% BYOD for certain types of late-phase studies, for example. But when we are talking about BYOD, we're meaning what sometimes people refer to as hybrid studies, or there's always a provisioned option for those patients who don't have a suitable device and don't want to use their own device. And this topic, I've been operating in the eCOA space specifically for 15 plus years, and I think BYOD has been particularly fascinating for me, as we've kind of jokingly indicated. We've been talking about this for a long time. But I would suggest, and I've heard this echoed from some of my colleagues in other eCOA providers, in some ways we kind of stopped talking about this about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and I think that's because we kind of reached a tipping point where largely we're kind of got to the point where we finally accepted that BYOD is okay. And I kind of bring to mind that the famous William Gibson quote that the future is already here, it's just unevenly spread. And I think we as eCOA providers see a really interesting mix of sponsors who completely accept BYOD. They're just like, of course, BYOD will give patients the choice, versus those who are still very uncertain, who are still citing concerns around regulatory risk, consistency, privacy, equity, all these things we're seeing on the screen here. And I think the important thing to say, and it was really interesting to hear the conversation earlier where BYOD was brought up due to patients expressing their choice. Really, I see this as a patient choice thing. We should be giving patients the choice of how to engage with their study, with the caveat of it always depends. It's going to depend on your study design. I don't think any of us are going to sit up here and say you should always 100% of the time have BYOD in your study. I personally would say you should always 100% of the time be strongly considering having BYOD in your study. But there might be certain scenarios where it doesn't make sense. And I think we've definitely moved on as an industry in regards to how we're thinking about this. There was an updated task force report on comparability between different modes of data capture about a year ago that really called out BYOD specifically, that we're largely comfortable around the comparability issue, the so-called mixed modes issues in most scenarios. We don't see that being an issue anymore. There's enough evidence that we're happy that patients respond consistently across these different modes, even though it's typically a smartphone-based solution. And then from an operational point of view, really the modern technologies we eCOA providers are using today, typically you're seeing the solution that's on a provision device is the exact same app that patients are installing on their own device. It's just on the provision device, that device is locked down and the only thing they can access is that data entry app. So in regards to privacy, security, encryption, all that good stuff, it's the exact same security, privacy, encryption that we're using on a provision devices. So from that kind of operational implementation, privacy, security point of view, there are not really all that many issues. I'm very curious, though, to open up maybe up here from my sponsor colleagues and our site colleague around, some of those differences that potentially you see, but certainly from the eCOA provider perspective, we met as a consortium yesterday, the eCOA Consortium, and it was interesting hearing the amount of studies we're seeing with BYOD now, numbers from 70% of our studies up to one of our members said 100% of their studies have some aspect of BYOD. So BYOD is here, it's being used, and we want to help you all get on board with that. But yeah, curious what my panelists think.
I think from the site perspective, I love BYOD. We do not have to wait for those devices to come in, so we can get started earlier and get activated quicker. At the end of the trial, we don't have to collect all those devices. And then also, I think that our patients have busy lives. So when they travel, they don't have to bring that device with them or remember to bring that device with them. If they're a busy mom constantly on the go, they get that notification that they need to complete their assessment. I think that for a lifestyle perspective, I think it works really well for our patients. The only time I see as an issue is if we have a 65-plus trial and those patients are older, and especially at my sites that are in rural areas like rural North Carolina, they don't have devices that can do BYOD, and not all sponsors or trials are providing those devices, provisional devices nowadays. That's something I'm actually seeing more and more often, is that those extra devices aren't being provided. So as a site, then we're scrambling. If it's a hard to enroll trial, we're trying to find a way to get a device that they can do it. So we might purchase tablets, but that's really expensive to do across 100 plus sites for a site network. But I love BYOD, and I get great responses from our subjects that they also love it.
I'll just add, because from a sponsor perspective, we would love to see BYOB. It's very costly to provision all these devices, and it puts a big burden on our study budget. And in fact, I've seen a lot of pushback more recently on even including COAs because of the budget pricing. So it'd be great to have a reduction here. It'd be perfect. I guess that was my question, the acceptability from a patient. We do a mixed model. So we'll say you can use a web app or whatever, and we'll do provision devices. I'm getting a lot of requests in saying they all want the devices. So that's why I wanted your perspective on what you think is out there. Maybe we need to do a better job in really sensing that.
I think it depends from indication to indication, because maybe a large vaccine trial, an obesity trial, something where the subjects are completing a lot of assessments, and a lot of assessments early on. If it's an obesity trial, they're doing it every 3 days after treatment. If it's vaccine, they might be doing it for 6 days after that initial treatment. So I think that's key there too.
I'd also add the other variable that's important to consider is in these global studies, the country are actually rolling out in. And, as eCOA providers, we're typically recommending a percentage of provision devices you might want to provide alongside the BYOD offering. And we're tailoring that for various things like your patient population, but also the country you're rolling out in. And so depending on the country and the saturation of suitable technology, we see recommendations of low teens, all the way up to 40, 50, 60% provision devices, just because we know in that specific country, your patient population isn't going to have access to those devices.
Yeah, from our perspective, I pretty much agree with Lynn. So yeah, we would love to see that from a cost reduction perspective as well as timeline reduction, because the same time that we save from shipping away these devices, we also get it back at the sponsor side. From a patient centricity perspective, of course, it comes down to preference. And I think, to Paul's point earlier, I've been working on eCOA for like 15 years, and the last 10 we've been discussing about BYOD. So the way we should be looking at it is that it's a matter of preference. And that's what it is, because you could get one patient that would prefer having a separate device, keeping things separately, as someone would prefer to have a separate work phone, or you could have someone else that wants to combine them and have them all at one, with the perks and the disadvantages of each choice. So I think that's how we should see it, knowing that, from a regulatory perspective, we are covered, since I know very well that, it's 99% of the times it's the same app, to Paul's point, so there isn't any real difference to that. So I think we've gone past the time where we were discussing what happens if you get a phone call that interrupts you. We've been covering ourselves in terms of data privacy and security, and so we should really look at it as a matter of preference.
Yeah, and I think that the biggest word there in that bubble are two words of the regulatory acceptability thing. There was a question I heard earlier around BYOD, and at least the framing of the question I heard was around the regulatory acceptability, and I think we heard the answer of it depends, and I think it does depend. But if I can give my view of that is that it depends, but in general, where patients want to use their own device, then it seems that this is being well accepted by the regulators. Mm.
And I want to ask as well that it's now, I think, well received by measure owner. And I know a few measure owners that are still very concerned. Maybe that's not the word, but they used to be concerned with BYOD, and I can see the word here, standardization, indeed, to make sure, and comparability of the mode of administration, but I think it's not an issue any longer. And I think in terms of licensing, as long as the processes are done properly, I don't think it's an issue any longer from the copyright holder's perspective. They may have some specific restrictions, but that's here now.
And I was kind of expecting that to be my maybe slightly more substantial response, is copyright holder acceptance. And just to be clear, you're saying that you don't see that, generally speaking, as an issue today?
Not any longer. It used to be, It used to be, and we had this paper that we have published together, you know, the white paper
Yep.
that we published in 2025, you know, about flexible approach to data collection, and we have the copyright holders' perspective. And yes, at the time, it was 5 years ago that we did this research. We had barriers and concerns, and they were not at all in favor of BYOD, or they were having a very conservative restrictions in terms of comparability. But now I can see an evolution, and I think it's because of the technical response as well. You know, that is providing reassurance about the comparability of results. Yeah.
Yeah, that's important. Again, just to flag up the white paper that's available on the eCOA Consortium's webpage and the PCE Consortium's webpage is from our Flexible Approaches project, which is almost completely done. And that is an important piece of work. The sample size wasn't huge, but I think it gave us some really important information about the realities of the copyright holder's position, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. We shall move on to scenario 4. Okay, quite a specific scenario here to think about. Screening diary for inclusion-exclusion. The inclusion-exclusion criteria for a trial requires completion of a screening diary for 7 days with a completion expectation, or essentially a compliance rate, of 6 out of those 7 days. So the question here is, I need to scan across to that. We don't have the question there. What? Which of these strategies is the most viable, ensuring the highest chance of compliance with that target? So I think there's 5 options there. And this is one of those, Alex and Lynn, I'll be asking you to give your own personal perspective on as well. But actually, Alex, when we get the results in, we'll come to you first on this one, if we may. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. We were just talking about the Flexible Approaches project, and that's winning. Right? Yeah, there you go.
Problem solved. Let's never talk about it again.
Okay. Just give it another few seconds. So I'm kind of interested to get into a bit of a discussion about dedicated compliance monitoring, and I know, Jennifer, you've got some thoughts on that. But I think we got a fairly good split there. So, Alex, how would you react to that? What is the best strategy here to achieve that target?
Yeah, so I would struggle to pick one, to be honest. I like breaking down problems to smaller pieces, or I should really not call that a problem. Maybe, hopefully, if we take into account some of the considerations that we discussed today, it's more of a challenge. So looking at this from I would like to break this down to a preventive approach and a corrective approach. So similar to the CAPA framework, for those of you that are involved with inspections. Let's think about what can we do to prevent this from becoming an issue, and then also how we can support the trial after it has started in order to comply to this inclusion criterion. So looking at it from a preventive perspective, I think that we as sponsors are responsible of designing our clinical protocols, keeping in mind that we shouldn't be dooming the patients for failure. We should rather be setting them up for success. So first of all, why would we need such an inclusion criterion? I think it's quite self-explanatory that our data, especially at the screening period, needs to be trustworthy. However, there are things that we can do so that we can provide some sort of flexibility for the patients as well as the sites. And this is depicted in the answers that we see here, but looking at it from a preventive perspective still, maybe I can give you an example of one of our recent trials at Bayer. So we actually had a very similar inclusion criterion that was part of our clinical protocol. But what we did is that we had a longer screening window. So that was about 14 days. And then we were looking at the last 7 days prior to that baseline visit. And that was what this inclusion criterion was about. So this gives the patients and the sites some room for becoming comfortable using the devices so that we can ensure that the patients are trained and then the sites know how to use. I see that here you have voted 46 of you for a compliance monitoring. This allowed us that extra week where everybody could be used into using these tools to achieve this target because it's a necessary target. So I also see there that there is an option that is about, so the winner here is the flexible data collection option. So I think we spent quite some time speaking about this in the previous scenario. So I would spend some more time on looking some of the others now. So retrospective data collection is a big controversial topic because it's a matter of balance, really. We strive to collect as much data as possible, and for that we want to give the flexibility to the patients for a longer window. At the same time, human memory becomes a limiting factor. So I personally would struggle to remember what I even ate yesterday. Although in this case, I had the dinner at a nice Ethiopian restaurant here at Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of reasons to remember that. It was quite tasty, but at the same time, out of the usual. So yeah, still digesting that. So back to the patients. I would argue that it's difficult to remember how was your pain severity 3 or 4 days ago. So for that reason, we have to keep some sort of balance. And coming back to the example of the Bayer trial that used this inclusion criteria, what we did there is we defined some time windows. So on this study, we had reporting of the data twice daily. So it was quite intense. We had a morning and an evening diary. So we defined in the protocol, and actually one important point here is that you don't always see the retrospective data collection being part of the protocol, but it's very important and good that it is, so then it leaves less room for interpretation later down the line. So what we did is we defined in our protocol that we had time windows for these diaries. So we gave as broad of a time window as possible for a morning entry, let's say from like 5 a.m. or even 4 a.m. until noon, and similarly for the evening diary from, let's say, 3 p.m. until midnight. And then we also defined that retrospective data is allowed for the next 24 hours. So if, for whatever reason, the patient couldn't complete their morning diary, they could do it the day after. But then if not, then tough luck. We would write it off, and then we would have to, and that's why it's important that we have this leeway at the beginning, so that then we can find ways to react. And with that, let's move into the reactive part. So what can we do? So when the study is going, what can we do to live up to this? And there is plenty of things that we can do. There is 46 of you that have voted for compliance monitoring. So that is very, very important. Most eCOA vendors offer this by default in the standard offering, that we have compliance dashboards and reports where the sites can have a look and monitor the compliance. I would even argue that what is, in my experience, more impactful than compliance reports is email alerts, because a tool is useful as much as you use it. So having an email alert, so in that example that I spoke about earlier, we had an email alert that for the screening period especially, sites would receive an email notification if there was a day of missing data. And then we have the capability through the eCOA vendors to have this email alert being less strict for the treatment and follow-up period. So that's, yeah, quite important for me, but having Jennifer here in our panel, I think it would be interesting for me to hear your perspective. So how do you feel that these tools are used at the site, and do you feel that they actually make the difference?
So the compliance monitoring, it's the most crucial part. So if you have a high volume, quick enrolling trial, let's say 200 subjects per site, this is a resource burden. On a trial to that length, I would have to dedicate one full coordinator every day that all they do is just compliance. Contacting the patients, making sure that's completed. And something that I've seen a lot recently is some sponsors are trying to reduce their budget, and the way they're doing that is not providing compliance monitoring, and we actually have to manually check all those patients for 7 days, 200 times a day. And so it's not all sites have that type of resources to be able to do that, and they also don't necessarily see in the protocol that might be a barrier for them, and they're not able to plan ahead to see that. And then what ends up happening is that can cause quality issues. That can cause, it's a bottleneck. It just creates issue after issue. But I think that what I have seen is not only just central compliance vendors that not only keep up with compliance, but also help contact the subjects. So they might give them a call if they haven't done their diary. I don't think there's much that we can do to prevent the patient burden here, But if it's a requirement for the protocol, there's nothing we can really do to eliminate that from the protocol.
Yeah, I can add, we actually have implemented the email alert to the site when we've seen low compliance, but we've had a lot of pushback from the sites on that because of the resource that's needed to actually look at the report and then make a phone call to the patient and find out what's going on.
And to put in perspective, if you have multiple trials that are also doing this across the site, all they're doing all day long is just receiving those emails back to back to back, which also seeing visits all day long. So a coordinator might be in visits for 8 hours a day. They're not going to get all those emails. So that's where you have to have that dedicated staff member to be able to do that.
So, Lynn, in that scenario you just mentioned, sorry, Paul, I think you were going for the microphone there. So how did you deal with that? That pushback that comes from sites? For something that for a tool is meant to be helpful, that's the intention.
It was. I mean, some did, some didn't. That's what it came to at the end of the day. So we still had data missing as it was coming through. And we would then handle it in-house. And then we'd have a query actually go back then to the vendor to help try to push it through and figure out if something could get resolved. But it's a touchy line. It really is, because not all sites are staffed the same way to handle this. And as you mentioned, the monitoring from a sponsor perspective has been greatly reduced as well. So it's difficult. Yeah.
I guess I'd just add from the eCOA provider perspective, I'd kind of build on something Alex said in regards to setting the patient up for success, setting the study as a whole up for success. We often see this approach as being a really good way of ensuring that you're going to get good compliance after you've actually enrolled these patients in the study. They kind of have this period of getting familiar with the technology. You're also identifying the fact that these are patients who are able to engage with the solution. But I think one of the hardest conversations we can get into as eCOA providers with our sponsors is kind of this expectation that the technology can just solve everything, and the technology can solve a lot, but it can't necessarily solve everything, including a bad study design or just hugely burdensome effort on patients or on sites as well. And so if you are actually struggling to hit this compliance rate, it's not necessarily something the technology can magically fix. Yes, the technology has to be really user-friendly. Yes, there has to be good notifications. There's a lot we can do to give a more positive experience for patients. But at a certain point, it gets down to a discussion around, well, is this study design even feasible? And there's only so much technology can do to round out the edges on the bad study design.
And I will say, to add to that, when you are patient-centric, that drives retention. And so retention and quality is always going to be key. So anything we can do to increase that patient centricity is essential.
And I guess to link it back to the conversations we had before lunch, you shouldn't be learning at this point that actually this is too big a burden for the patients in the study. You should have understood that in conversations with your patients before you even got devices in their hands.
Very fair comment. I did take a note of one full coordinator day solely to oversee compliance, right?
That's every day of the week. So that's all they're doing, 40 hours a week, is just compliance.
I think that's quite a telling thing, isn't it, really, in terms of what we're trying to be site-centric. We try hard to do these things, trying to accommodate the realities, but if one person is spending their life reviewing that. I mean, when I was still overseeing eCOA studies, I was logging in every day, because you kind of get hooked on it in a bit. What's happened, what's changed? But that relentless demand to do that that's hard. And I guess from a site perspective, is it difficult to resource for that? What's the reality?
It is very difficult to resource for that, and also to spot that as soon as possible, that's something that's needed, because very rarely at a site do you have an extra set of hands. We need more hands all the time. So to have that, that's something that we would then have to hire a new employee and get them trained all before the trial has started. Because we don't know that we're necessarily even going to get selection on that trial, so we can't go ahead and staff that employee. So it's a large hurdle to get through, especially for a site network where you have 30 plus sites on a trial. We're hiring a lot of heads there.
Yeah, amazing. That's a really important piece of information to share in this session. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, we'll move on to the fifth and final scenario. Unapproved paper PROs used at site. This never happens. The site elects, not the site, other sites are available. not this particular site, elects to print off paper copies of PROs for a participant, but it could be multiple, to complete as the participant doesn't like using the provisioned eCOA device. The paper versions are not approved. There's a lot of risk in this one. So answers are already incoming. So for those of you who are registered for the eCOA forum tomorrow afternoon, we're obviously going to be touching on this general subject of where paper is appropriate. So Paul was talking about questions and issues we've been discussing for many years. I've been in the eCOA space for 22 years now. We're still talking about it. Okay, so how's the numbers looking? Who's winning?
Slower responses this time. I think people are...
People having to think about it. We're going to wait until it gets to well over the 100 mark. So we have a majority, at least, of those in the room.
What is that? Pretty mixed. Electronic backup is tough. And ensure paper versions are licensed and managed as opposed to deviation.
Okay,
So undefined program. Yeah, pretty mixed.
that's good. So wrestle with that one, Jennifer. How would you? I mean, what's the reality? It's great to hear your direct perspective, but what's the best mitigation here from your
Sure.
perspective?
So when we recruit subjects, if a device is required, we make sure that a subject will be comfortable using a device. And we do a lot of training to ensure that that process goes smoothly. So if a subject is having an issue with the device and they no longer want to use that device, it's typically because we've had repeated issues that have been unable to be resolved. Typically that starts with the help desk. We go to the help desk. No resolution there. I currently have a help desk ticket that is 6 months and ongoing that I've continued to follow up on. And then we go to our CRA, we go to our CTM, we go to our PM. We read the manual thoroughly. We've gone through every avenue we can. We would not just jump to paper. I currently have a study ongoing where we had multiple patients that were in our office for 4+ hours trying to resolve, to avoid using paper. It is a very hard to enroll trial. We did every avenue that we possibly could. We brought the subject in the next day. They sat in the office for another 2 hours. They were wanting to drop out of the study. So for the purposes of retention, we thought it'd be better to have data than have no data or have a subject drop out. So we moved forward to paper because we did not have any other option. This is a big barrier that I see, and I think something that I have my sites do is that every SIV, we just have this discussion openly with our monitor that this is likely that it could happen. What would you like us to do? And if we follow all those steps and it's still not happening, we need a break glass in case of emergency plan that works for both the sponsor and both for the patient.
Go ahead.
A question now. So in the cases where you had to go to paper, were they at least the correct licensed version approved paper with headers and footers?
We try our best to do that. I make sure that my sites are frequently, anytime that there's an update, that they are getting those, but they are across multiple studies. There's a lot going on. Sometimes that is an element that is an issue, and that's sometimes where we're always trying to get in contact with our CRA beforehand to make sure that it is correct, and just letting them know that that's what's occurring so they can check all those things.
Yeah, it's a sticking point, and that's why I've moved to providing paper when absolutely necessary with the proper format in place where it's got the right trail on it and everything. But I've experienced sites and studies that just kind of printed them off the internet somewhere and they pulled down the wrong version and everything else and they used it. And then we had to disallow the data, basically. So, because it wasn't properly procured.
And I think that's where setting the sites up to success, to knowing that these issues occur, so let's go ahead and have them have the tools they need, that if they've used every avenue and they can prove that, then let them go ahead and use it, especially, like I said, for those difficult to enroll trials where these patients are hard to come by.
Yeah.
Quick note, quick note on the licensing perspective. I think, it speaks for itself, with the title. Unapproved paper PROs, you cannot do that. At the end of the day, you have to have the proper permission and you have to have the right version.
Right.
I think that's the main risk, at the end of the day. So you have to do this properly with the copyright holders. They would procure the right version to be used in the study.
In the middle of a trial.
In the middle
You're
of the
right.
trial.
I mean, but
You
in the
have
middle
to
of a trial,
anticipate that, as
I
much
mean,
as
this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to reveal what it really means to manage this sort of scenario. So everything you said is absolutely correct. And you know, Caroline, and something we've kind of advertised a little bit is the COA Measure Owners Forum, which is something we started last year. We got a good number of what we call measure owners, so it's copyright holders, license managers, talking about these sorts of issues. We've had a couple of great meetings talking about sample copies and requirements and timelines for licensing. But this is a kind of nice case study to examine what the realities are. Thinking back earlier, we said that it was not the best option to go ahead and use a PRO without permission to do so, even though you would communicate it out. So again, this is almost like a similar scenario, right?
Yeah.
So what's the best way to deal with this?
Well, you have to discuss, with the copyright holders. You have to just present the situation. If there is a case like that, maybe that would be easier for some copyright holders to say, okay, you can go ahead, but we provide the right version. It's also discussion you can have with copyright holders. They are not always so restrictive. They can understand. They have the responsibility to make those instruments used in the studies. This is also to their best interest to. As I said, earlier, they are partners now. They want to make sure that the questionnaires are used properly and that they can be useful. It's not just, getting permission. They want to be part of that. So, of course, it depends on some copyright holders, for sure. But you have to initiate those discussions and start, finding solutions with them, having them on board on that. Yeah.
I mean, I 100% agree with that. I think maybe the reality we sometimes see in studies is just sites make that decision in the moment because of the needs of the study, and they're just the practicalities is there isn't time to have those conversations. And I'm not speaking on behalf of my company here, but I personally find it hard to criticize that decision too much. I mean, to address the winner here in regards to the highest priority was providing an alternative electronic backup, so a web backup. And, we as an industry have talked about web backup as being the preferred backup solution for many years now. I think the reality is that that's kind of still in flux on the ground as to what we're seeing used in studies. And again, purely personally, I think if a patient is, as this specific scenario is saying they just don't want to use the eCOA solution, I don't think web is necessarily the answer to that for this specific patient. And again, I find it hard to personally say, well, then we're just going to completely rule that patient out when there is the possibility of the site administering paper and then having that data. As long as you're very carefully tracking that data in the system, you can identify how this data was captured, paper data versus electronic data. Smarter people than I can have that discussion then around about what you do with that statistically. And I'm sure we'll get into this tomorrow, but I just think we need to, in certain circumstances, be a bit more flexible in how we're thinking about these things.
And again, I think, what is important is to make sure that you have the right version. Because I agree, and sometimes, copyright holders, we have license agreements that provide a permission to use, whether it is on paper or on eCOA. So at the end of the day, you can potentially use the content, but you have to make sure that you have the right content. I think, to me, that's the key part. At the end of the day, yeah.
And I think something I see sometimes as well is sometimes sponsors have no flexibility. So when we run into these hurdles, if the subject is not willing to continue to move forward with the device, then that subject is done. But it's, we have a great relationship with our patients, and I saw on a recent oncology trial that a subject was having issues with the device. They weren't able to get it done, and so we weren't able to give that subject treatment. And that's really hard. I mean, these subjects they're looking for the treatment. They finally think they found a solution. They're ready to be in the trial, and then we can't enroll them, or we have to discontinue them from the trial. And that's really heartbreaking.
And maybe a final point that I think we haven't done much justice on this scenario is the fact that let's think about the reason. Why is it that the patients cannot use the device and they have to go to paper? So, because we've been discussing mostly about what do we do then. So the reason in most of the cases is some technical challenge with the devices. And for that, we have our winner here with 45 votes of the web backup that most eCOA vendors now offer as standard. So thanks COVID for that. But in addition to that, I feel that the main limiting factor here is how help desk supports the sites. So Jennifer mentioned that in her initial point, but I feel that I've seen studies that this is very strong, and therefore the sites have this confidence on the help desk and they would call, and then they would get the resolution, because there is a resolution on a way. Usually this happens because the questionnaire doesn't show on the device. So if there is a well-trained help desk agent, which is there 24/7, available for the patients and the sites, then there should be a resolution. And I've seen the contrary as well. Studies like, to Jennifer's point, that the sites have lost faith to the help desk because they are not trained appropriately, and therefore they didn't get the support that they needed at the time that the patient is there at the site, and they need it right there then.
And that is true. It's very rare that we have a help desk that can actually help. Yeah.
Can I dig at that just a little bit? Because it's the punch bag, I think, of eCOA implementation, I think, in many ways. How do you deal with it? I mean, you're not getting a response. You've got a participant in the clinic. What's the reality of trying to manage that situation? And we've got a lot of context missing here, because you talked about the oncology situation, which is horrific. We're very interested in this room about rare disease as well, and we know that data is so important. But how do you deal with the realities of a patient there who just can't get it done?
It is very stressful. So a coordinator is trying to work with them. And so then the subject gets frustrated. So, they've been there for 30 minutes. Okay, they're frustrated. The coordinator's running back to their desk. They're also seeing other, because this time is now bled into their other appointments. So they're running to see other patients. They're running back to their desk to try to talk with the help desk. The help desk isn't answering. Then the help desk has you on hold. Okay, so let's also, now her site manager is calling the CRA, trying to get them involved. The subject is getting further and further frustrated. They've now been there for hours. They haven't had a meal. Might have been a fasting appointment. You don't know. There's not a great way to manage it. There's also very limited opportunities that we can even provide that subject with a meal or anything else to compensate them for their additional time. So in these cases, if the subject is staying and willing to go through all that, they are doing everything they can. We are doing everything we can. So I think it's just assumed that we jump to paper because that's the easiest solution. But that is a stressful day for a coordinator. That's a stressful day for everyone involved.
100%. Any reaction to that? Just nods. Okay, got that. Fair on that. Okay, thanks, Jennifer, for sharing that so candidly. So we're kind of the question and answer stage. You've got multiple stakeholder groups here. We would encourage most people to put their hands up, and we'll get our wonderful microphone carriers. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Jillian Lusk, and I'm with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Group at Pfizer. I used to work in eCOA, so I appreciate everything that you were saying here. One routine pain point that I've encountered is once the floodgates have opened to allow one paper backup, shockingly, there's all these device issues that these sites are reporting now, and gosh darn it, they have to use paper more frequently. So what are your thoughts on striking the appropriate balance of having the break in case of emergency solution, but not walking down a path that was never your intention when it comes to paper data in a study that's supposed to be eCOA?
So I've seen it handled in a good way where we have to come to the study team saying and shown everything we have done and shown this certain scenario and get pre-approval. But they typically have a dedicated staff member that is able to answer those questions at any point. So we're not sitting there and waiting with the subject on site. And I think that's the best approach is requesting approval. So even though having those paper, they can use it when they need it. We have everything we need, so we don't have to rush and print it off, and it might be the incorrect licensing and all of that, but you still have to request approval. And I think that's the best way to mitigate that, because they should only be using it when they have to. So have you done all things? Because sometimes I feel is that my coordinators are so busy running about from subject to subject that they might forget about an avenue. So sometimes it's nice to be reminded, oh, have you tried this? Because they might not have been. Or, you know, maybe that person isn't helping you, but someone else on their team can. And really push that. So I think getting that approved is the best method.
Just that from an eCOA provider perspective, you know, we definitely see that trend sometimes as well. Obviously, as an eCOA provider, we are responsible for making sure the system's working in the first place and that the help desk is answering their phone. But assuming we're doing that, you know, I think as a sponsor, you know, the responsibilities around monitoring as well, and maybe identifying that, okay, we thought we'd see eCOA data come in here, we haven't seen it come in, what's going on? Then you following up with the sites and trying to get them back on the technology as well, and obviously with support from the eCOA provider. But going back to that monitoring piece as well, and the importance of just what's expected, is that actually happening, and then following up if not.
Flo and then Michelle.
Sorry.
Sorry,
hi.
I couldn't see the
That's okay,
microphone. My
no
apologies.
problem.
Go ahead.
Michelle Carty, IQVIA, with some experience as a developer also. I wanted to just push Paul a little bit on the regulatory acceptability. I've seen quite frequently what you're saying, I feel like is true in terms of we're over a lot of the operational hurdles, but what we aren't necessarily over is quackery and some people who claim to have the expertise to program all these devices and make sure everything works for BYOD, but as a developer, I've seen so many things that weren't tested, reminders don't go out, everything else. So anything is only as good as its implementation, so I think probably, I'm not trying to put words in regulatory's mouths, but I think that might be the thing that stops them from saying, sure, we accept BYOD.
Yeah. You have to be working with someone who knows how to implement the technology, and then the technology is only one part of this. It's often the technology is the easiest piece, but still people get the technology piece wrong. But then using that technology in a way that captures the data in a way you can trust. I guess I would just ask if any of our regulatory colleagues want to comment on that in the room, but maybe probably not. But
We just don't have time, Paul.
And I'd recommend piloting.
Great point.
Run pilots
Oh, sorry.
to prove it, because I've done that with different types of technology.
That's interesting. We should do a session on that. Flo.
Yeah, so I was going to, question to the panel about the question that we were talking about inclusion-exclusion criteria and completing the diary. And I think, Alex, to your point about thinking about how we prevent that as well. I feel like sometimes we don't do a good enough job of explaining to participants the importance of this data collection. And I think especially, you know, sponsors are just catching up a lot of, you know, as an industry with the fact that, no, it's really important now that we do capture the participant voice in our trials and that their PROs are included as endpoints. And so I don't know that we explain to participants how important that data is and what it's being used for. And I wonder also when it is being used for inclusion-exclusion criteria, people are not coming in to participate in a clinical trial just to be screen failed. So do we explain it well enough that actually, if they don't comply with that diary collection, that they won't be able to participate? And I think that would also go a long way to mitigating some of that.
Yeah, very much agreed. And it should really be very clearly defined as part of the consent process to also explain what this data is used for so that the patients have full buy-in and take responsibility for being compliant. Yeah.
Any other comments on that? Great. Michelle?
It's really great to have the site level perspective. I think that's been missing for some time. I think some of us remember many years ago when there was almost literal physical battles between the eCOA vendors and the sponsors one time at this meeting with things being said on panels. So I may have missed this. I'm going to break Cheryl's rule and ask a two-parter. One is in terms of having to magically use a backup that because something's happened, how often is that really occurring? And then are the sites, from the site perspective, given sufficient information in their operation protocols and manuals about when to initiate a backup and what to do. Because I think that's important for people to hear here who have to go back and fight internally in their companies when they're working with the vendors to ensure that that stuff's being built in.
Yeah, I think it depends from trial to trial how often we see it, and I think it's how well a system is built, how well those help desk are and everything like that. So I think in a trial where we don't have all those mitigation strategies and that it's not done on the front end, I would say it's a lot that ends up happening. But when all the mitigations are in place and there's a great relationship with the vendor and the help desk, I don't see that. And I'm sorry, could you please repeat your second question?
The second question was, do you feel that your SOPs that you're given in manuals by whoever you're doing the contact with, the collected data, is sufficient to help mitigate these things? And I guess to your point about you can tell a difference based on how things are written, are sites allowed to give feedback about what their needs are going to be then?
In terms of the manuals, I would say it's kind of 50-50, but I'd say something that tends to be a bigger barrier is, as Lynn mentioned earlier, there's a reduction in CRAs almost everywhere, and they're very stretched thin. They don't often know their manuals, so when we have a question, they're unable to answer our questions. I think that's a barrier.
I'm going to just add to that. I do feel we provide backup mechanisms. I do think we fall short in making sure that the sites fully understand how to implement that. And I think we need stronger communication with the sites in explaining that.
I've been instructed by the medium of Elisa to wrap up. So my apologies to the others who wanted to pose a question. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel. Please join me in congratulating them for their contribution.